In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends in Christ, I am Father Anthony Brausch, the President and Rector of Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for our Gardner Lecture. In a special way, I want to welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Robert George, who has graciously made time to be with us here. So welcome, Dr. George. Tonight's speaker and his topic brought to mind the comment of the British writer Evelyn Waugh when he commented about his experience of conversion. Quote, "Conversion is like stepping across the chimney piece out of a looking-glass world where everything is an absurd caricature into the real world God made, and then begins the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly." End quote. More and more it seems the world is made up of looking glasses and caricatures. I am confident tonight's topic will be firmly grounded in the good earth of reality. I now invite Father David Entris, the Dean of Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology, to introduce our speaker this evening.
It's a real pleasure this evening to be able to introduce Dr. Robert George. Dr. George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has served as Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the President's Council on Bioethics. Dr. George was a Judicial Fellow at the U.S. Supreme Court, and he holds many degrees, including a J.D. and an MTS from Harvard University, and several doctoral degrees from Oxford, in addition to 22 honorary doctorates. His essays and reviews have appeared in a variety of places, including Yale Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, Columbia Law Review, and the Review of Politics. He has a number of books, including Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, In Defense of Natural Law, and finally, The Clash of Orthodoxies and Conscience and Its Enemies. We're very pleased to have Dr. George with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Rector, and Father Dean, thank you as well. It's an enormous pleasure to be with you this evening, and I want to thank my dear old friend, Ken Craycraft, for the honor of being here. He invited me to come. And what a special treat it was for me to discover when I sat down at Mass a little earlier, an even older friend, Professor David Foster, with whom I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, back in the Middle Ages. It's just such a joy to be with you again, David. I want to talk with you this evening about natural law, God, and human dignity. And to begin, I want to talk about how we know anything. One's knowledge of natural law, like all knowledge, begins with experience, but it does not end or even tarry there. Knowing anything, knowing is an activity, an intellectual activity to be sure, but an activity nonetheless. We all have the experience of knowing, of going from ignorance of a subject matter that catches our attention to learning something about it, knowing something about it. Moving from wondering about what's going on here, what's the case, what's happening, how this thing works, to devising a strategy of some sort, however informally, for figuring out how it works, As little children, we would take the toy apart to figure out how it works, to the aha moment, the insight, where we see a bit, we understand a bit, we grasp a bit about how this works. So we all have the experience of knowing, but we know that knowing is not merely having an experience. Knowing is a complex and dynamic activity. The role of experience in the activity of knowing is to supply the data on which the inquiring intellect, the mind, works in the cause of achieving insights, understanding. Insights, then, are insights into data provided by experience. They are, as the great Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan brilliantly demonstrated by inviting readers to observe and reflect on their own ordinary intellectual operations, the fruit of a dynamic and integrated process of experiencing, understanding, and judging. So now let's turn to a specific area of knowledge of natural law. How do we know what we know about natural law? What are the data supplied by experience that are at the foundation of what I will call, following Aristotle, Father Rector, practical judgments? Now, by practical judgments here, let me hasten to point out, I don't mean merely pragmatic or useful judgments. I mean judgments of what it makes sense to do, what is to be done, what we ought to do. Judgments with a view to acting, where we need to make a choice, a decision about what to do. So what are the data supplied by experience that are at the foundation of our practical judgments? That is to say, insights that constitute knowledge of natural law. Well, they are the objects of intelligibly choice-worthy possibilities. Possibilities that, inasmuch as they provide reasons for acting, reasons of a certain sort, that is, more than merely instrumental reasons, we grasp not as bare possibilities, but as opportunities. Now, I know that sounds really obscure, so I will explain it. In our experience, an experience every single one of us in this room has had and has, of true friendship. You've had friends, right? You have friends. You have the experience of friendship. And true friendship, that is not just two people using each other, a genuine friendship where friend A wills the good of friend B for the sake of friend B, and friend B wills the good of friend A for the sake of friend A. In our experience of true friendship, for example, we grasp by what is ordinarily an effortless exercise of practical reason the intelligible point of having and being a friend. We understand that friendship is desirable, not merely for instrumental reasons, that is, not merely because of what you can get out of it, because you're friends with Bill Burley, a very important man, you get invited to the best parties. You get investment opportunities that you otherwise wouldn't have. Those are instrumental benefits which may attach to a particular friendship. But if we're talking about a true friendship, and we've all had the experience of true friendship, we understand, we see the point of friendship where the point is not reducible to other things to which friendship is a mere means, but rather we grasp the point of friendship as intelligibly valuable, desirable, choice-worthy, worth doing, just for, and above all for, its own sake. Indeed, all of us are aware that a purely instrumental friendship is no friendship at all. If the only reason I want to be in a relationship with my friend Bill there is to get invited to those parties, to get invited to have these investment opportunities, Well, whatever that is, that's not a friendship. It might not be anything bad, there might not be anything unjust about it, but it's not a friendship. Bill and I have a genuine friendship because whatever instrumental benefits for either of us there may be in our relationship, we don't value the relationship simply for those instrumental benefits. We value it for its own sake. I will Bill's good for Bill's sake. Bill wills my good for my sake. There's a bond between us not reducible to instrumental goals and ends. Because we grasp the intelligible point of having and being a friend, and we understand that the fundamental point of friendship is friendship itself, and certainly not goals that are extrinsic to friendship, to which the activities of friendship are merely means, we reasonably judge that friendship is intrinsically valuable. And we judge that whether or not we happen to be philosophers, whether or not we're able to put it in the fancy terms, the language I'm putting it in this evening. Even people with very little education and no interest at all in philosophy form friendships. They form friendships because they see the point of having and being a friend. You don't have to be a philosopher to understand that. All philosophers try to do is explicate it, explain what's going on there. Just ordinary people in ordinary life act on basic principles of natural law, like the principle that it's worth having friendships. It's worth having and being a friend. We know that friendship is a constitutive and irreducible aspect of human well-being and fulfillment, and that precisely as such, whether we could put it in those terms or not, we grasp it and we understand that precisely as such, friendship provides a reason for action. That is, a reason to enter into relationship that requires for its intelligibility no further or deeper reason or subrational motivating factor to which it is a means. And friendship is simply one example of many that we could pick out, where people naturally, just in the course of everyday affairs, whether they're fancily educated or not, whether they're philosophers or not, just all of us going about our business, grasp the intelligible point of doing this or that, or being this or entering into this relationship. Grasp the intelligible point where that point is not a means to some other end, but as something that we understand as being worthwhile in itself. So, just to take another example, let's shift our focus to the activity of knowing itself, to seeking knowledge. What we're all doing here this evening at this very moment. I'm speaking, you're listening, I'm trying to convey some things that I think are true, you're listening to try to learn from what I say, trying to evaluate what I say. Is he right about that? Is he wrong about that? We're seeking knowledge. That's the activity we're engaged in this very moment. In our experience of wonder and curiosity, of raising questions and devising strategies for obtaining correct answers, taking apart the toy and so forth, of executing those strategies by, for example, carrying out lines of inquiry, of achieving insights, we grasp by, again, what is ordinarily an effortless exercise of our practical reason, the intelligible point of searching for truth and finding it. We understand that knowledge, though it too may have tremendous instrumental value, is intrinsically valuable as well. Knowledge is most fundamentally intrinsically valuable, whatever instrumental value it may also have. So, to be attentive, well-informed, thoughtful, clear-headed, careful in one's thinking, critical, judicious in reaching conclusions and judgments. To be those things is to be inherently enriched in a key dimension of human life as rational creatures, as human beings. We reasonably judge the activity of knowing, then, to be an intrinsic and not merely instrumental good, what some philosophers call a basic human good. That is to say, a constitutive and irreducible aspect of our flourishing as human beings. Knowledge of natural law begins with knowledge of the goods for the sake of which we have reasons to act, precisely because those goods are irreducible aspects of our well-being and fulfillment. So like friendship and a number of other types of activity, could go on with more examples, knowledge provides a reason for choice and action that requires for its intelligibility as a reason no further or deeper reason or sub-rational source of motivation to which it is a means. Let's just stay with the example of what we're doing right now. If you were explaining to a friend what you did tonight, so it's tomorrow morning. Fred says, oh, what'd you do last night? Oh, I went to a lecture by this professor who came to town over at the seminary. Why would you do that? Well, to learn something. Well, why would you want to learn something? Well, because knowing things is just good. Knowing things, that's an intelligible thing to do. You don't need any further. And let's say the person is skeptical and said, well, I mean, was it a happening place? Did you go there to be seen among the cognoscenti, the beautiful people? No. I mean, was the lecturer really entertaining? No, he was not entertaining. He was all the boring stuff, intelligible reasons for action, all this stuff. So why did you go? To learn something, in the hope that I would learn something. And that is a sufficient explanation. The reality is your friend would get it. You wouldn't need even to explain what you're going to do with the knowledge. Are you going to build a bridge? Are you going to get a job? Are you going to impress people at cocktail parties? You wouldn't need to give any of those explanations. Your friend would understand because he or she sees the point himself or herself of going from ignorance of a subject matter or a limited understanding of a subject matter to a deeper and better and richer and fuller understanding. Now, if what I've said so far is true, is sound, is true, knowledge of natural law then is not innate. That's a mistake people frequently make. They think natural law is natural because it's innate. It's not innate. It does not swing free of experience or of the data provided by experience. Even when it is easily achieved, practical knowledge, knowledge of natural law, is an achievement. It's the fruit of insights, which, like all insights, are insights into data which are supplied by experience. How did you come to understand the intelligible point of friendship, of having or being a friend? It was when you were a little kid and you had your first experiences of friendship, once you were old enough to actually engage in a relationship. Same with knowing. How did you come to grasp the intelligible value, the irreducible intrinsic value of knowledge seeking? It's from your own elementary experiences, ordinarily very early in our lives, of moving from ignorance to knowledge of a subject matter. The insight, the knowledge that friendship, say, or knowledge is itself intrinsically humanly fulfilling, is rooted in our elementary experiences of activities of friendship and knowing. Apart from those experiences, there would be no data on which practical reason, the mind, the intellect could work to yield understanding of the intelligible point and thus of the value of friendship or knowledge, and the judgment that these activities are intrinsic fulfillments of the human person, and precisely as such, objects of what Aquinas called the first principles of practical reason and basic precepts of natural law. All the talk sounds fancy, and that's because I'm trying to give a theoretical account and explanation of something that's not fancy, that's routine, that's mundane. It happens every day to us as we make our way through the day. We're acting on basic practical judgments of what is intelligibly choice-worthy. Now, of course, not all practical knowledge is, strictly speaking, moral knowledge. That is, knowledge of moral norms or their correct applications. I haven't said anything about morality up till now. though all moral knowledge is practical knowledge. That's true by definition. Moral knowledge is knowledge about what to do and not do. So all moral knowledge is practical knowledge. But some of our practical knowledge isn't, strictly speaking, moral knowledge. To know that knowledge itself, let's say, is intrinsically good and provides a reason for action will not tell us whether it is morally right or wrong to steal a textbook in order to learn from it. The fact that I'm doing it for the sake of knowledge doesn't mean it's right. We need norms of morality, a kind of second-order level of norms that govern our choices, whose objects are those first principles of practical reason, identifying ends or purposes as intelligibly worthwhile. I'll say more about that in a moment. Knowledge of the most fundamental practical principles directing action toward those basic human goods and away from their privations, though not strictly speaking knowledge of moral norms, is foundational to the generation and identification of such norms, of moral norms. And that's because moral norms are principles that guide our actions in line with those primary principles of practical reason, integrally conceived. I know that also sounds obscure. I'll explain it. Norms of morality specify, they're specifications of the directiveness, the prescriptivity of all the various aspects of human well-being and fulfillment that together constitute the ideal of integral human fulfillment. I see some of the guys in white are nodding their heads. You see what I'm up to here, right? You see what I'm getting at. It was your guy. I'm stealing all this from. So if the first principle of practical reason is, as Aquinas says, the good is to be done and pursued, and the bad is, malum is, to be avoided, then the first principle of morality, I would suggest, is that one ought to choose, and otherwise will, always in a way that is compatible with a will toward integral human fulfillment. And just as the first principle of practical reason is specified, as Aquinas makes clear, by identifying the various irreducible aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, friendship, knowledge, aesthetic appreciation, skillful performance, religion, our relationship with God, and so forth, so too the first principle of morality is specified by identifying the norms of conduct that are entailed by an open-hearted love of the human good, a total love of the human good, a will to integral human fulfillment, the good of human persons taken as a whole. And so, for example, when we teach our children that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, we teach them what Jesus taught us. We're giving them a specification of the principle that one ought to will in a way that's compatible with the will toward integral human fulfillment. We ought to will, favor the good of people in its wholeness. Treat other people as you would have them treat you. Or when we, those of you who are mothers are familiar with this, right? When you have to tell the kid, no matter how good the end is, a good end doesn't justify a bad means. The Pauline principle that you shouldn't do something in itself evil, that good might come of, even that good might come of it. And says, but mom, all this good would come. All these great things would happen. I'm just telling a little lie. And you say, no. Again, you're giving the child a specification of that principle that you got to will consistently with the human good, considered integrally with human fulfillment as a whole. And that's true of moral norms at more specific levels, not just these general norms like the golden rule or the Pauline principle. How about thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not bear false witness? Again, specifications of what it means to act with a will toward integral human fulfillment, all the way down to the most specific norms. Don't hit your sister. Specification of that master principle that we should will consistently with the good of all in its wholeness, the good in its wholeness, integral human fulfillment. So, A theory of natural law is a critical reflective account, and there are competing theories of natural law, obviously, but any such theory is a critical reflective account of the constitutive aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of human persons and the communities that we form. Such a theory will propose to identify principles of right action, moral principles, specifying the first and most general principle, that of acting in a way that's compatible with the will toward integral fulfillment. And among these principles are respect for the rights people possess simply in virtue of their humanity. Rights which, as a matter of justice, others are bound to respect, and governments are bound not only to respect, but to the extent possible to protect. Now, we live in a time when some people seem to suppose that all morality boils down to a matter of rights. That's a mistake. But we shouldn't make the opposite mistake of thinking that there are no moral principles that are properly characterized in terms of rights. My beloved friend and colleague and honorary godmother, Mary Ann Glendon, has made this point so beautifully time and time again, especially in her book, Rights Talk. If you haven't, it's an old book of hers, but it's absolutely timeless, and if you haven't read it, you should. She shows, I think, quite rigorously that while rights talk has been inflated so that everybody claims a right to everything, and rights talk has to some extent obscured things like duties, responsibilities, everything's a right, nobody's got a duty. So all that's true, and so she wants to push back against that. She doesn't want to go to the extreme opposite pole of saying there's no such thing as human rights. There are no principles of justice properly characterized in terms of rights. I think there are rights, and those rights are moral principles. Now, natural law theorists, at least those of my ilk, understand human fulfillment, the human good, as you've already seen from what I've said so far, as variegated. I keep talking about human goods, right? I'm not talking about one thing that is the human good, or one thing that all the different human goods can be reducible to. I've got a pluralistic understanding of the human good, a variegated understanding. My understanding, and I think the correct understanding, which is why it's mine, if I didn't think it was correct, I'd do something else. I think there are many irreducible aspects of human well-being and fulfillment. Friendship, and so does Aquinas, by the way. Friendship, knowledge, critical appreciation of beauty, art, for example, music, literature, the pursuit of virtue for its own sake, not just to look good. Religion, our striving for friendship with God, to be in a proper relationship with God, the relationship God wants us to have with him. All of these things provide more than merely instrumental reasons, precisely because they're irreducible aspects of our overall or integral fulfillment as human beings. Now, to affirm, as I do, the variegated nature of the human good is not to deny that our nature is determinate. I affirm that our nature is determinate. There is such a thing as human nature. It doesn't change. It is fixed. What I'm affirming is that our nature, though determinate, is complex and irreducibly so. For example, we are animals, right? We're biological organisms, but rational. We're not like the brute animals. Our integral good includes our bodily well-being because we are organisms, we are biological realities, but also our intellectual, moral, and spiritual well-being. We are individuals, right? We come packaged as individuals. I can't get in your head, you can't get in my head, we can bump into each other, but we're separate creatures. And yet, friendship and sociability are constitutive aspects of our flourishing. So by reflecting on these basic goods of human nature, especially those most immediately pertaining to social and political life, natural law theorists propose to arrive at sound judgments or a sound understanding of principles of justice, including those we call human rights. A lot of people talk a lot of nonsense about human rights. We shouldn't talk nonsense. but we shouldn't dismiss the idea of human rights. And notice that the church in our time does not dismiss the concept of human rights. Whether we're talking about Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II, going all the way back to the Council and even before, popes are affirming, standing up for human rights, rights we have simply in virtue of our humanity, not rights that we have to earn or achieve, like degrees or even a driver's license with a test. These are rights every human being has, and simply by virtue of being human. In light of what I've already said about how natural law theorists understand human nature and the human good, it should be no surprise to learn that natural law theorists typically reject both strict individualism and collectivism. People try to push us into one camp or another. It happens all the time, you know. Either you got to be an individualist or you're a collectivist. If you're an individualist, you're not a collectivist. You're a collectivist, you're not an individualist, but you got to be one or the other. But individualism, in the philosophical sense, or what might be called radical individualism, overlooks the intrinsic value of human sociability and tends mistakenly to view human beings atomistically. It fails to account for the intrinsic value of friendship and other aspects of human sociability, reducing all human relationships to means by which the partners collaborate with a view to more fully or efficiently achieving their individual goals and objectives. If any of you have read the work of Ayn Rand, for example, you will see a very classic form of individualism. It's not that Rand doesn't think people can or should cooperate with each other or have relationships with each other. She's fine with that. She thinks you have to. But why do you have to? Because that's how you advance your own goals. The relationships themselves are not inherently or intrinsically valuable. They're valuable instrumentally so that each party can achieve his or her own individual goals and objectives more efficiently, more fully. Collectivism, on the other side, compromises human dignity by tending to instrumentalize and subordinate human beings and their well-being to the interests of larger social units. We've seen this now for way more than 100 years. So the good of the individual, the good of the person, gets subordinated to the good of the community, the state, the Volk, the fatherland, the Führer, the future communist utopia. That's why the church teaches us that collectivism is an injustice. Socialism is an injustice. That doesn't mean we should be Ayn Randian individualists, though. Individualists and collectivists both have theories of justice and human rights, but they are, as I see it, highly unsatisfactory. They're rooted in important misunderstandings of human nature and the human good. Neither individualism nor collectivism can do justice to the key ethical concept, the one that's so brought into the foreground by Pope John Paul II. That is the concept of a human person. That is, a rational animal who is a locus of intrinsic value and as such an end in himself, who may never legitimately treat himself or be treated by others as a mere means to other ends, but whose well-being intrinsically includes relationships with others and membership in communities, beginning with the community of the family, in which he or she, as a matter of justice, has both rights and responsibilities. Human rights exist or obtain if it's the case that there are principles of practical reason directing us to act or abstain from acting in certain ways out of respect for the well-being and dignity of the persons whose legitimate interests may be affected by what we do. I certainly believe that there are such principles. The church teaches that there are such principles. It seems to me that any rational analysis or judgment would conclude that there are such principles. These are principles that cannot be overridden by other considerations, such as utility. The whole school of ethical thought called utilitarianism supposes that you can override other considerations in the name of utility. But if there are such things as human rights, They cannot be overridden by considerations of utility. At a very general level, human rights direct us, now to borrow a phrase from Immanuel Kant, to treat human beings always as ends and never as means only. When we begin to specify this general norm, we identify certain important negative duties, such as, to take what is today an uncontroversial example, the duty to refrain from enslaving people. We all think we have that duty, right? We all think it would be wrong to enslave another person, even if you had the power, even if you could get away with it. We recognize that other people have a right not to be enslaved, no matter how powerful we are. Although we need not put the matter in terms of rights, it's perfectly reasonable and I believe helpful to speak of a right against being enslaved and to speak of slavery as a violation of human rights. It's a right that people have not by virtue of being members of a certain race or sex or class or ethnic group, or being of a certain age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency or anything like that, but simply in virtue of our humanity. Why should we not enslave Harry, even though we could get away with it? Because Harry's a human being. As such, he has basic dignity and a right not to be enslaved. But there are, in addition to negative duties, like the right against being enslaved, and those corresponding rights, the rights that correspond to those duties, certain positive duties. And now things get tricky. These too can be articulated and discussed in the language of rights, though here it's especially important that we be clear about by whom and how a given right, positive right, is to be honored. If you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, there are negative rights, and then there are a whole bunch of positive rights. That makes it look very different from the American Bill of Rights, which is full of negative rights. The UN Declaration has a lot of positive rights as well. Sometimes it's said, as for example it's said in the UN Declaration, that education or health care is a human right. Now, it's certainly not unreasonable to speak this way, but much more needs to be said if it is to be a meaningful statement. Why should those persons or institutions be the provider? Who is supposed to provide education or health care to whom, and why these people rather than those people should be the providers? What place should the provision of education or health care occupy on a list of social or political priorities? Resources are limited. We can build a swimming pool or a library. Should we build the swimming pool or the library? We don't want to build half a swimming pool and half a library. We've got to make a choice. How do we prioritize? Education and recreation, for example. Is it better for education or healthcare or recreation to be provided by governments under socialized systems, or by private providers in markets, or by some combination of private and public initiative? And if so, what should the mix be? These questions go well beyond the application of moral principles and cannot be resolved simply by applying the moral principles. They require, in addition to a sound understanding of morality, prudential judgments in light of the contingent circumstances people face in a given society at a given point in time, with its conditions and history and traditions and resources and limitations and all that go with those things. And often there is not a uniquely correct answer. Not only is there not a morally uniquely correct answer, even prudential judgment may not be able to identify this answer rather than that answer as definitively the best. Sometimes you just have to make a choice. We could build the library, we need it for these kids. We could build the recreation center or swimming pool, we need it for these kids. We could build the hospital, we need it for people who are sick. What do? We don't have enough money to build all three. Different societies with different circumstances, different conditions can make different decisions without us saying that society did it wrong. The answer to each question can raise further questions, and the problems can become extremely complex, far more complex than the issue of slavery, to go back to that example of a negative right, where once a right has been identified and its universality has been established, the basic terms of its application are fairly clear. Everybody has a moral right not to be enslaved, not just Harry, but Bill and Joe and Arthur and Sally and Jill. And everybody has an obligation as a matter of strict justice to refrain from enslaving others. Governments have a moral obligation to respect and protect the right against being enslaved, and correspondingly to enforce the obligation. Now, what I've said so far should provide a pretty good idea of how I think we ought to go about identifying what are human rights. But in each case, the argument must be made, and in many cases, there are complexities to the argument, and we are destined to never be able to say finally, definitively, that the argument can now end because nobody has anything else to say about it. We do the best we can. Now, the natural law understanding of human rights I'm here sketching is connected with a particular account of human dignity, and I owe you that account. Under it, the natural human capacities for reason and freedom are fundamental to the dignity of human beings, the dignity that is protected by human rights. The basic goods of human nature are the goods of a rational creature, a creature who, unless impaired or prevented from doing so, naturally develops and exercises capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. These capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice are God-like, albeit, of course, in a limited way. In fact, from the theological vantage point, they constitute a certain sharing, limited to be sure, but real, in divine power. God has seen fit to share with us a bit of his own power. This is what is meant, I believe, by the otherwise extraordinarily puzzling biblical teaching that man is made in the very image and likeness of God. After all, the teaching in Genesis that man is made in the image and likeness of God cannot mean that God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose. All right? So what does it mean? How are we God-like? Well, God is free and rational. God acts for reasons. God envisages a state of affairs that does not exist, understands that bringing that state of affairs into existence would be good, and brings the state of affairs into existence, not in a demiurgic fashion, not on impulse or instinct, but by the rational exercise of God's own freedom. And God saw that it was good, not that he was waiting to find out. He envisaged the good that provided the point of making the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and indeed us, and endowing us with the godlike powers of freedom and reason. But whether or not one recognizes biblical authority or believes in a personal God, it's true that human beings possess a power traditionally ascribed by believers to divinity, namely the power of agency, the power of an agent to cause what the agent is not caused to cause. No one causes God to create, right? And we have a little bit of that freedom. We call it free will. Now, some of our friends don't think we have. Some of our secular friends don't believe in free will. Some of our Protestant friends, especially our Calvinist friends, some of our Lutheran friends don't believe in free will. But the natural law account cannot do without it. Norms of natural law are action guiding and presuppose the freedom to act. They are norms for free choices. So, the state of affairs that we may freely act to create may range from very trivial sorts of things to very big things. It may range from anything from the development of an intellectual skill or the attainment of an item of knowledge or going to the gym to lose some weight or stopping smoking in order to be healthier, to the creation or critical appreciation of a work of art, to the establishment of a marriage and marital communion. the moral or cultural significance of the goods that we realize through our freedom, choosing rationally, may be great, or more commonly, as we go through every day, comparatively minor. What matters for the point I'm now making is that it is a product, the choice is a product of human reason and freedom, the fruit of deliberation, judgment, and choice. Now, of course, the further question will present itself to the mind of anyone who recognizes the godlikeness of our capacities for rationality and freedom, capacities that are immaterial and, as such, spiritual in nature. And that question, of course, is whether beings capable of such powers could exist apart from a divine source and ground of their being. So one finds in the affirmation of these powers a decisive ground for the rejection of materialism, and one discerns the basis of an openness to and even the roots of an argument for theism. But more on that point in a few minutes. Let's turn now to the question of God and religious faith in natural law theory more fully. Most but not all natural law theorists today are theists. That's been true historically. They believe that the moral order, like every other order in human experience, is what it is because God creates and sustains it as such. In accounting for the intelligibility of the created order, they infer the existence of a free and creative intelligence, a personal God. Indeed, they typically argue that God's creative free choice provides the only ultimately satisfactory account of the existence of the intelligibilities humans grasp in every domain of inquiry, not just in the practical or moral domain, the domain of natural law, but in the domain of natural science, in the domain of social science, in every other domain of learning. Natural law theorists do not, of course, deny that God can reveal moral truths, and most believe that God has chosen to reveal many such truths. The Decalogue, for example, the Ten Commandments, certainly the right-hand table. However, natural law theorists also affirm that many moral truths, including some that are revealed, can also be grasped by ethical reflection apart from revelation. That is, by the exercise of our reason, our practical reason. And so I assert with St. Paul that there is a law written on the hearts. Paul teaches this in the letter to the Romans. A law written on the hearts even of the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses. A law, the knowledge of which is sufficient for moral accountability. You can be held accountable. You can't, it's not an excuse to say, no one ever told me about God. No one ever told me about Jesus. We can hold people accountable for this kind of moral knowledge, even if they haven't heard the gospel, haven't encountered the Hebrew scriptures, the law written on the heart. So the basic norms against murder and theft, for example, though revealed in the Decalogue, are knowable even apart from God's special revelation. They're knowable as principles of natural law, accessible to natural reason, unaided by revelation. The natural law can be known by us, and we can conform to its terms by virtue of our natural human capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. Now, the absence of a divine source of the natural law would be puzzling, just as the absence of a divine source of any and every other intelligible order in human experience would be puzzling. An atheist's puzzlement might well cause him, as it has caused many former atheists, to reconsider the idea that there is no divine source of the order we perceive and understand in the universe. It's far less likely, I think, to cause someone to conclude that our perception of an intelligible order or a set of intelligible orders, in moral, natural, and so forth, is a sham, though that's, of course, still logically possible. The question then arises, can natural law, assuming there are true principles of natural law, provide some measure of common moral and even political ground for people who do not agree on the existence of God or the nature of God or God's role in human affairs? This is something that St. Pope John Paul the Great, John Paul II, certainly hoped for, that natural law could be a common idiom, a common set of understandings, so that people who had radically different ideas about divinity, theists, polytheists, pantheists, panentheists, atheists, could nevertheless find common ground, find common language, find some common basis for at least fundamental truths in their affirmation. And I agree. I think anyone who acknowledges the human capacities for reason and freedom has good grounds for affirming human dignity and basic human rights, whether they agree with me about religion or not, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian, pantheist, Zoroastrian, atheist. These grounds remain in place whether or not one adverts to the question, is there a divine source of the moral order whose tenets we discern in inquiry regarding natural law and natural rights? Now, of course, I happen to think the answer to that question is yes, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Christian, I would think that, and that we should be open to the possibility that God has revealed himself in ways that reinforce and profoundly supplement what can be known by unaided reason. Revelation is an extraordinary gift. But we do not need agreement on the answer to that question, so long as we agree about the truths that give rise to it, namely that human beings possessing the godlike, literally awesome powers of reason and freedom are bearers of a profound dignity that is protected by certain basic rights. I have a very distinguished colleague in religion, just recently retired, Jeffrey Stout. He recently gave the famous Gifford lectures in Scotland, who is an unbeliever, who is an atheist, and yet he believes in human rights, just as I do. Now, why does he believe in human rights? His reasons parallel my own. He says, well, yeah, it's true that human beings have certain qualities that are traditionally ascribed to divinity and that are literally awesome. The powers of reason and freedom. These elevate us above the brute animals. And beings with those awesome powers deserve respect. They are persons. They have rights. The difference between us is that I think I can account for why there are such persons. And that account brings God into the picture. He doesn't want to do that. He says, yeah, human beings have godlike powers. And they're real. They're the powers traditionally ascribed by Christians and other believers to divinity, but I don't believe there is a God. But that doesn't mean I don't believe that those powers are real and that they're the foundation for understanding human beings as bearers of dignity and human rights, you see? So, if there is a set of norms, including norms of justice and human rights that can be known by rational inquiry and understanding and judgment, even apart from any special revelation, then these norms of natural law can provide the basis for a common understanding of human rights. That's what Pope John Paul hoped for, an understanding that can be shared even in the absence of religious agreement. And yet, while we can hope, and while we can try, and while we can do our best, and we should, and while we can reach out to others who have very different views from ours and try to find the common ground, and if we're people of goodwill and they're people of goodwill, we will find some, still, realistically, we cannot hope for consensus. There are moral skeptics who deny that there are any moral truths. There are religious fideists who hold that moral truths cannot be known apart from God's special revelation. And even among those who believe in natural law, there will be differences of opinion about its precise content and implications for certain issues. So it is, I believe, our permanent condition to discuss and debate these issues, both as a matter of abstract philosophy and as a matter of practical politics. I have rattled on for too long, and I want to leave some time for questions. But before doing that, I just want to discuss one more thing. This is really for the seminarians who I know are studying ethics and what these days is called meta-ethics and what we traditionally called fundamental moral theory. Let me just say a word for the seminarians. about the respects in which natural law theories are both like and unlike the major competing theories. Natural law theories are both like and unlike utilitarian and other consequentialist approaches to morality on the one hand, and Kantian or deontological approaches on the other. Like utilitarian approaches, and unlike Kantian ones, natural law theories are fundamentally concerned with human well-being and fulfillment, and indeed identifying principles directing our choosing toward basic human goods and away from their privations as the starting points of ethical reflection. So utilitarian theories are theories about the human good. Natural law theories are theories about the human good. The touchstone, the bottom line, where we begin and what we're after is the preservation, the advancement, the protection of the human good. Unlike utilitarian approaches, however, natural law theorists understand the basic human goods, the basic forms of human good, at least as they figure in morally significant choosing, as incommensurable in ways that render senseless the utilitarian strategy of choosing the option that overall and in the long run promises to conduce to the net best proportion of benefit to harm, however benefit and harm may be understood. So this is why natural law theorists like myself reject not only classic utilitarian approaches, such as that of Jeremy Bentham, or even the more sophisticated and revised approaches of people like Bentham's star student, J.S. Mill, but also reject the consequentialism of Catholic theologians who identify themselves as proportionalists, who think that the principle guiding our choices pertaining to human goods should be a principle of optimizing the good, choosing that which will produce the net best proportion of benefit to harm overall and in the long run. Now, natural law theorists share with Kantians or deontologists the rejection of aggregative accounts of morality, like the utilitarian accounts, that regard the achievement of sufficiently good consequences or the avoidance of sufficiently bad ones as justifying choices that would otherwise be excluded by the application of moral principles in ordinary circumstances. So the natural law theorists are with the Kantians and the deontologists on that one. And that's why we conclude even a really, 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 really good end doesn't justify even a little bad means. Unlike the Kantians, however, natural law theorists do not believe that moral norms can be identified and justified apart from a consideration of the integral directiveness of the principles of practical reason, directing human choice and action toward what is humanly fulfilling, toward integral human fulfillment, and away from what is contrary to human well-being. So natural law theorists do not believe in purely deontological moral norms. Practical reasoning, moral reasoning, is reasoning about both the right and the good, and the two are connected. The content of the human good shapes moral norms inasmuch as they are entailments, specifications of the basic aspects of human well-being and fulfillment considered integrally. Finally, this is for everybody. I gave the seminarians their thing. This is for everybody. There's one proposition that's stressed by natural law theorists that pretty much spans all the different schools of natural law thought. We have all sorts of debates among schools of natural law theory, but this one, I think, is one that everybody has in common, and we all stress it. And that's the fact, or what we natural law theorists at least believe is the fact, that by our choices, we not only alter states of affairs in the world external to us, but also at the same time determine ourselves, determine our own characters. We constitute ourselves, for better or worse, as persons with a certain character. So we reject David Hume's idea that we make our choices, they go out there and affect the world, but they don't have any impact on us. We think choices have intransitive as well as transitive consequences, that they shape us for better or worse. It's like you tell your kids, if you do bad things, you become bad. If you want to become good, you do good things. It's Aristotle's teaching. How do you become virtuous? By doing what's virtuous. How do you become vicious? By doing things that are vices. How do you become courageous? Do courageous things. How do you become dishonest? You steal and you lie. They shape us. They don't just go out from us and change the world. They change the world. The world's different because of the choices we make, at least in some little tiny way, but they also shape us. So recognition of this self-shaping or intransitive quality of morally significant choosing leads to a focus on virtues, something I haven't said anything about yet, as habits born of upright choosing that orient and dispose us to further upright choosing, especially in the face of temptations to behave immorally. So people will sometimes ask, it's a big question today, you natural law people, you Catholics, you people who believe in this, and it's not just Catholics, I mean, they're distinguished Protestant and Jewish natural law theorists, but Catholicism has always been identified with the natural law tradition. Many of the greatest natural law thinkers in history and also today are Catholics. So people will ask us, is natural law a rule theory or a virtue theory? Is it about rules or is it about virtue? Is natural law theory a virtue ethics? If it's not, should we have a virtue ethics instead of a natural law ethics? If natural law is just about rules, that sounds kind of bad. That sounds kind of stodgy. That sounds kind of mechanical. Aren't virtues what really matter? Well, it seems to me the answer is that a natural law theory, if it's worth anything, is about both rules and virtues, and they are integrally connected. A complete theory of natural law identifies norms, rules, principles for guiding us, for distinguishing right from wrong, but also and at the same time and relatedly, habits or traits of character, virtues, whose cultivation disposes people to choose in conformity with moral norms and thus compatibly with what we might call, borrowing again a phrase from Kant, a good will. That is, a will toward integral human fulfillment. And with that, I thank you for your exemplary patience. Okay, great.
Okay, so we do have an opportunity for a few questions, and there are seminarians on both sides. And if you will just signal, and we'll start right over here.
Thank you, Professor George, for your talk. I wanted to ask a question that, yeah, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I wanted to ask a
This
question.
better be a good question. This is my student. I'm responsible for this.
So in terms of the meta-ethical side of things, you have a variegated account, a complex account of human nature. And I wanted to push back on that perhaps in two ways, one philosophical, one theological. Philosophically, your account would make sense of natural law in the Thomistic sense, but how would you deal with the treatise on happiness in the Secunda Secundae, where Aquinas talks about a single end of human life? On the one hand, philosophically, how would that fit into your account? And then second, theologically, how would you deal with if we are in the Imago Dei and our practical...
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
If we're in the image of God, we have the Imago Dei, and our practical reason is a reflection of the divine mind, how would you account for the doctrine of divine simplicity, in which presumably God doesn't act for multiple ends, but just one?
Yeah, okay. So on the first point, of course, there is a profound sense in which our ultimate goal, our ultimate end is union with God. All right, that's what's on offer. But we're also taught by our faith, and reason it seems to me reinforces this, that the good that we do in the world by our choices for the sake of human goods, our upright choices for the sake of human goods, is not just a test for our suitability for a future relationship with God. Those goods last and are of significance and not merely instrumental to getting us into this other thing, a relationship with God. Seeing that relationship as an other thing, completely apart from those goods, such as those good acts become merely instrumental, I think is just contrary to what the church teaches us, certainly at the Second Vatican Council, where we're taught, for example, that at the end, when Jesus delivers all the goods of this world, the goods that are produced by our actions to the Father, we will find them again. They're not lost. We'll find them, but burnished and freed from stain. So I think we can understand that there's, in a sense, an ultimate good, the one thing, but it's got complexities. It's one thing, but complex. Our union with God is unifying with Him, realizing the capabilities, the capacities that He made us for as we lead our lives acting for the sake of ends that are intelligible because, like God, we can grasp them and act for their sake and bring about what would not, but for our choices, have been brought about, and which is good, and we can, as God did, see that it is good. Now, your other question was about divine simplicity and us being made in the image and likeness of God. Of course, this is a big worry for our Muslim friends. You notice that there's a lot of stories from the Bible that you find in the Quran or get integrated into Islam. They don't do what Christianity does with what we call the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Scriptures, which take it as a full book. But of all the stories, Old Testament stories and ideas that end up in Islam, the one that you don't find there is that man is made in the image and likeness of God. And their big worry about that is that it lowers God, it lessens God, it makes God too much like us, and indeed, it compromises the principle of divine simplicity. But we do have it on the authority of Scripture itself as authoritatively interpreted by the church, that we are in fact made in the image and likeness of God, and that it cannot be our physicality that's the thing about us that is godlike. So, when Aquinas, for example, addresses the question in the Summa, admittedly in the Summa, he focuses like a laser beam on the powers of reason and freedom in explicating Genesis 1 on the creation of man, and does not worry that that could be interpreted as compromising divine simplicity. Mr. Burley over here has a hand up.
I was struck with what you were saying about the range of prudential judgments that people can come up with, because it seems like today so many people are insistent that there isn't a range on any given issue, and that there's only one right answer, and it must be done this way. And it gives one the impression that the reason that people are so insistent is that they actually don't believe in reason to begin with, and that they've sort of let the will hijack everything. Is that a legitimate analysis of what's going on today?
Yeah, I think it is. The reality is that although there are certainly, as the church teaches us, and as I argued this evening, there are certain moral absolutes. There are things that should not be done under any circumstances that just are beyond what is morally permissible in any condition. Most of our morally significant choices are not between what is strictly right and what is strictly wrong, but rather are between or among rationally available, morally available options, but where, because of the incommensurability of the basic forms of human good, the options offer different costs and benefits. And so those have to be assessed prudentially in view of all the background considerations, our resources, our needs, our traditions, our history. We need to make sense, or make our choices make sense in view of our previous choices, so that things are not just chaotic. A choice might not be bad in itself, but it may make no sense in view of what we've already chosen. Building a roof without building the house, that doesn't make sense. Not there's something wrong with building a roof, but you build the roof without building the house, that doesn't make any sense at all. Our friends over here in the white will recognize the key concept here. Aquinas puts a lot of weight on it. It's the concept of determinatio. Yes, okay, good. I was worried because heads weren't right. So Aquinas says that with respect to a lot of our choosing, we move from the natural law to the positive law, or to policy, as we would say today, not by a direct deduction, as we do in some cases. From the wrongfulness of rape, we can figure out that rape ought to be banned. It ought to be against the law. That doesn't require a determinatio. But in a lot of other cases, we move not by a direct deduction, but rather by this process of choosing among rationally available, morally available options, which are incompatible with each other nevertheless. And yet we have to make a choice. The simplest example, the natural law tells us that human health and safety are goods to be protected because human life is valuable, right? All right, so we know that as a matter of natural law. It's not optional. Government has an obligation to protect human life. So now we develop motor cars and we have highways. So we say, well, wait a minute. We got motor cars, we have highways, people are bashing into each other, people are running over pedestrians, not because people are wicked, not because people are bad, it's just because it's chaos out there and there are no rules. We need some rules. The reason ultimately is protect human health and safety, right? That's the natural law. But now how do we get to the rules? Can we deduce them? Can we do a deduction of, say, the answer to the question, should we drive on the right or the left? You know that you should make sure that the cars are going this way or on one side of the road and going that way on the other side of the road. You know you've got to make a decision. Cars either have to drive on this side or that side. It's got to be one side. But there's nothing in the natural law itself that tells you it is a requirement that we drive on the right. We do it one way, Britain does it another way. It's not that one way is morally right and one way is morally wrong. The natural law doesn't dictate an answer to that question. That is a matter of determinatio. So is the whole elaborate scheme of traffic regulation. Take any city. There's going to be an elaborate scheme of traffic regulation. Questions of where you put the stop signs, here and here, or how you manipulate the stoplights. Whether to make these avenues one way, these streets one way, these two ways. All those decisions are not translated directly from the natural law by deduction. They're made by a process of determinatio, by which we choose authoritatively, those who are properly constituted as the authorities choose among the morally available options, those that as best they can see will make the most sense for our society today. And in some cases, the choice will be downright arbitrary, drive on the left or drive on the right. Now, you're right that today, in a lot of circles, people seem to have moved from being irrationally skeptical and believing that there is no truth to the opposite extreme of being utterly dogmatic and believing there is an absolute truth about everything and they've got it, and anybody else who doesn't agree with them has got to be shut down and not allowed to speak and not allowed to participate or has to be canceled. Right? We see that all the time. We've shifted from this radical skepticism to this radical dogmatism. And they're really two sides of the same coin if you think about it. The reality is that there is a legitimate relativity in human affairs. There are lots of decisions where there's not a single uniquely correct answer. Different people can reasonably make different decisions. I call this the notorious moral relativism of Catholicism. It's because the church has always recognized, as we go through the day, making our choices, raising our families, doing our work, fulfilling our obligations, we've got to make lots of choices that are not strictly between right and wrong. We're fashioning a life. Shall we take the family to the seaside or to the out camping in the woods for our vacation this year? You can't deduce that from the natural law. If you want to say that that's relative, yeah, it is relative. There's not a uniquely correct answer to that. And a lot of our choices are, including some very important choices. Now we Catholics believe that every human being has a personal vocation, and we believe that each human being has an obligation to discern that vocation. But we don't think that there's an objectively right answer to the question for everybody, should you be a lawyer or a doctor or a banker, right? Or an insurance salesman or an athlete, right? That we don't think that there's a uniquely correct answer to that. In a way, we think there is a uniquely correct answer to, is it right to kill unborn babies? Is it right to steal from people? Is it right to lie on your CV to get a job? We think there are uniquely correct answers. But that's a small fraction, very important, but a small fraction of the choices that we make. And you're right that today there's this danger of dogmatizing everything. So stuff that's actually legitimate areas where you could go down this way. Think of healthcare, the delivery of healthcare. There are many different ways to do that are morally permissible. Some involve more government, some involve more markets. Those decisions are really fundamentally matters of prudential judgment. But today there are people who are dogmatic, on both sides, by the way. People are utterly dogmatic about it. Don't see it as a prudential judgment at all. It's a strict matter of principle. We've got to have national health. We have to have a national morality require. Human rights require that we have a system like the English national health care system, which I suffered under for 5 years when I lived over there. Or that we need a strictly libertarian approach to health care, and government can play no role in it. Well, that's just unreasonable dogmatism on both sides. And you're right. People have fallen into that dogmatism. They identify their preferences with moral truth.
I was going to say about the driving, it seems the Italians have it figured out.
Have no rules. That's
You have all the rules and don't
Nobody
follow them.
obeys them. Yeah.
That's right. Drive where you need to and where you want.
Do you know this? This is a story that in my field of philosophy of law, we tell each other. It's about comparative law. I'm going to give you now a lesson in comparative law, so you can understand the differences between legal systems. So in England, everything is permitted unless it's prohibited. In Germany, everything is prohibited unless it's permitted. In Russia, everything is prohibited, even if it's permitted. And in Italy, everything is permitted, especially if it's prohibited. Now there, comparative law.
My question comes back to the difference between these positive rights and the negative ones that you were mentioning. And obviously, as you were explaining it, negative rights are those things which should not be transgressed, so they should, in a certain sense, be protected so that the human person can walk into those areas of freedom without somehow being obstructed by outside sources, government, whatever. Whereas positive rights seem to be those things which we should be able to enjoy, things we should have as given to us as we reflect on the flourishing human good in an integral fashion. I'm wondering, as you've studied this, you see a proliferation of these positive rights that should be supplied or be given or made, available in a material way to the person so that they can enjoy them and not denied to them. And how within this natural law theory do the theorists protect against maybe the unrestrained multiplication of these positive rights, which then a society, I guess, is obligated to find some way to provide to those whom they're materially denied?
Yeah, very good question, Father Rector. So the key thing is to avoid the error that gets us off on the wrong foot right off the bat. That's the error of supposing that if something is a positive right, what that means is the government has an obligation to provide it in a socialized national system. There, you're off on the wrong, it's over. The analysis now is going to go haywire no matter what. Now, to recognize positive rights, to recognize the intelligibility of the language of positive rights, doesn't mean that you believe government should never play a role in delivering education or recreation or healthcare or other goods that require resources that are limited. But it's to recognize that the community has got to make a judgment about what will make the most sense, all things considered, for this community with its resources, its traditions, its limitations, its history and so forth, its circumstances, as to how to provide as many people as possible with those goods. And that decision might involve letting the market do its work to a very, very considerable degree and keeping the government out to the extent possible. It might involve having the government have a pretty substantial role. The principles of natural law, moral principles, by themselves are not, in most cases, going to dictate an answer one way or another to that. We need to know a lot more than just what are the principles, that there is a right to education, in order to make a decision for this community. Shall we have a public school system? Or maybe instead of a public school system, give everybody money in the form of vouchers and let private schools grow up everywhere and people can send their kids to where they think the kids will get the best education, the education in line with their parents' values, using the government's money. Or a range of other possibilities. Nothing gets dictated by the principles of natural law about that. You can't do a deduction the way you can with something like rape or murder or theft or something, or any of those kinds of things. But again, you'll go haywire right off the bat if your assumption is to say that there is a positive right to education means that we need a system of government-run public schools, or we need a nationalized healthcare system. It just doesn't mean that. It doesn't necessarily rule those things out. But a lot of considerations have to be brought to bear, a lot of prudential considerations. What are the possible dangers of having a nationalized healthcare system? If you know people who've lived in England, they can tell you about some of those. What are the possible dangers of a public school system? Well, if your kids are in New Jersey public schools, first talk to me because we've got to get your kids out of there. But you'll know all about the dangers of indoctrination in values contrary to the parent's own, if you allow public schools effectively to have a monopoly because of the way you organize the tax system and so forth. All those things have to be taken into account in deciding what we, for our community, now will do. Do you see?
Yeah, but if it's not materially possible to provide that which is positive, seems to imply I should be able to do it. Is it really a right?
No, I mean, no.
Provided. So the right to education, and to have an education, would seem to only come about once it's possible to be educated.
Yeah, that's right.
If enough people, enough resources, enough leisure time as Aristotle say, actually enjoy being educated.
Yeah, ought implies can. There's no question about that. Principle's been around forever, and it will be around forever. There's no alternative to it. You never have an obligation to do something you literally can't do. I don't have an obligation to establish a university on Mars. I can't do it. So I have no obligation to do it. So it might be that certain human rights come into play only with a certain degree of development that makes it a can situation. At that point, we could have the ought. But prior to having the can, there's no ought.
Thank you very much, Dr. George.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, everyone, and have a great evening.